Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and every 5 years I buy a new MacBook Pro to be my daily driver, and I just got in my new one the other day. This is the MacBook Pro 14, and I decked this one out with the new M1 Max processor. And we're going to take a closer look at this and what it's going to do for me in just a second, but I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that I paid for this with my own funds. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this new MacBook is all about. Now, the price point on this starts at around $2,000 and goes up from there. This one has an M1 Max processor with 10 CPU cores and 32 GPU cores. And they have a bunch of different processor options to choose from. So there's an M1 Pro tier that you can get with 8 or 10 CPU cores and then less GPU cores. And then there's the Max tier that has greater GPU power. And I went with the higher end GPU power because video editing makes use of those GPUs, especially when you're working with 4K video, and that's a direction I would like to take in the next couple of years. So I figured if it's going to be a 5-year purchase, we're going to go to the Max here, although I think a Pro would have been fine for my current situation. Now, I configured mine with 32 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD. This being an Apple device means that you cannot upgrade it, so whatever configuration options you choose is what you're going to be stuck with for the life of the device. And with this being a 5-year purchase for me, I figured to go with the highest amount of RAM I could afford was the way to go. This ended up costing me about $3,200, but I am getting rid of some other stuff to supplement that cost. But still, it's a pricey device, and although it performs nicely, you can certainly get into a PC that will deliver similar performance in a heavier package for far less money. Now, the reason why I went with the 14 over the 16 is that I really like things that are not that heavy and are compact enough to travel with me. And there does not appear to be a significant performance disadvantage for going with the smaller footprint here. So I didn't see any need to get something larger, especially because I usually bring my MacBook Pro with me when I travel so I can edit video on the road. So the 14-inch here kind of fit all of the different parameters that I was looking for. And I'm quite happy overall with what it looks like and feels like. This is about 3.5 pounds. Or 1.6 kilograms. If I went with the bigger one, it was going to be 4.8 pounds or 2.2 kilograms. So a much heavier device without any real performance advantages. So I was very pleased with what they were able to pack into this thing. Now, the feature that stands out for me the most on the new MacBook is its display. This is running with Apple's Liquid Retina XDR technology, and it looks pretty close to what you would get with an OLED panel without it actually being an OLED. The secret sauce here is that they've got a lot of individual backlights that they can turn on or off depending on the content that's on screen. And the result is that you get super deep black levels that you would normally only see on an OLED panel. And I'm really impressed with what they've been able to do here. The display is running at a 3024 by 1964 resolution. It is a P3 wide color panel, and your aspect ratio here is 1.54 to 1. This model has the ability to go up to 120 hertz. They've got a variable refresh rate on it. You can lock in the refresh rate, but the most you can lock in is 60 hertz. So if you want to go higher than 60, you have to have it be variable. As you'll hear throughout this video, this is not a gamer's device, and this is one of the areas where, of course, gamers would want to lock in the highest refresh rate possible, and you just can't do that here. You have to rely on the computer to decide when to provide that faster refresh rate. Now, the brightness on the display is 1000 nits, and it has a peak brightness of 1600 nits when you're viewing HDR content. So let me show you what that looks like here. I'm just going to turn down the display a little bit so it doesn't blow out my camera. And I've got an HDR video I shot with my iPhone a little bit earlier, and you can see here it is bringing out additional levels of brightness, and that will continue even at the highest brightness setting of the display. So it has a really nice HDR component to it as well to bring out a little bit more brightness when your HDR videos call for that. All right, so now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the notch at the top of the display panel here. This notch is not a barrier, so your mouse can go right underneath it. And a lot of folks who are running a lot of things in the background that put icons up here on the menu bar have found that those apps will be sitting underneath the notch and you can't see them. So that's an issue that Apple and developers have to work out together, I think. For me, I haven't noticed it that much because I spend most of my time focused on the middle of the display. And I've been using this now for the better part of a week, and the notch really is not something I have focused on or looked at, even when I've got brighter wallpapers going. If the notch is a distraction, I would pick a darker wallpaper like this one, which will get rid of the notch completely as far as your eyes can see. And that's thanks to the fact that this display has such a great contrast ratio, it just blends right in with the top. So that's something I would suggest if it's really an issue for you. But for me, it's been fine so far. One thing that has been bugging me a bit, though, is the fact that although we got a thinner bezel on this, the menu bar on this model is a lot thicker. And if you take a look at what that menu bar looks like, you can see just how much thicker it is to accommodate that notch. And that's what's been bugging me more than the notch itself, is the fact that this thing is so thick and my menus look different. The Mac has always had the menus kind of look like this, where you pull down the menu and it's just right on the border there. But now it looks a lot different, and that takes a little bit of getting used to. Another thing that I noticed with it, let me pull up Final Cut Pro here for you, is that when you take an app like this one full screen, it doesn't actually nudge upward to go full screen. So check it out. I'm going to hit the green button here to go full screen, and you can see although it gave me more room on the bottom, the top did not give me any more room. And if I go to the MacBook Air that I've got sitting in the other side of the room here, when I go full screen, it will give me that extra screen real estate at the top. And then when I mouse over the top, it'll nudge things down a bit to give me the menu bar. So I get every inch of the screen on the old Macs. On the new one here, the menu is up there, but the app can't use that new real estate because the notch is in the way. So what do we get in exchange for this big notch at the top of the display? Well, we do get a better webcam. It's a 1080p webcam that can shoot 30 frames per second. It looks pretty good under my studio lights here. And it also does really well in low light. So this is just at night in my kitchen. When I turned off the lights here, you can see it does a pretty good job of denoising everything. You don't get a very grainy image. So the camera looks nice, but there are nicer webcams out there these days, and I was expecting a little bit more out of it than what we ended up with. But still, it is a much nicer webcam than we've seen on some of the prior MacBooks that would max out at around 720p. Now, this new MacBook is a lot thicker than the old one. You can see my 14-inch on the left and my wife's 13-inch on the right. It is noticeably chunkier, but that's a good thing because we get all of the things fixed that we didn't like about that prior generation machine. So what has returned is the MagSafe power connector here. And this was something people really liked because if you happen to trip over the cable, it just pops out very easily. The new cable, though, has nylon braiding to it, so it won't tangle up as easily. And it terminates to a USB Type-C connector, and it will work with any USB-C power supply. Mine with the Max processor came with a 96-watt power supply, the same one prior MacBook Pros came with. And as you'll see in a little bit, the performance on this one rivals that of machines that use 3 to 4 times the amount of power. It's pretty remarkable what Apple's packed into these M1 processors. We also have 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports here. Now, the cool thing about the Thunderbolt ports is that they still support power delivery. So if you're using a Thunderbolt dock, you can plug it right in and have it work like it did before, and you can leave the MagSafe cable in your bag. So you have a choice as to whether or not to power with the MagSafe connector or one of the Thunderbolt ports on here. You've got 2 of those ports on the left-hand side here, and additionally, these can do display output. And unlike the other M1 Macs that are out there, this one will power 2 displays through a single cable. And I did that a little bit earlier where I was able to get 2 4K 60 displays going out through a single Thunderbolt port on my docking station over there. I was also able to get power in and, of course, use USB data devices all through that single port. So you've got pretty much the same functionality now on the Thunderbolt ports that you had on the prior Intel devices. You have your headphone jack over here. On the other side, we have a card reader. so you can plug in your camera cards here. They do stick out a little bit though, so you can't leave them in. You got another Thunderbolt port here, and then you've got an HDMI output as well. Now, if you have the M1 Max processor, you can run 3 displays in addition to the internal display. The M1 Pro will support only 2 external displays. Now, the keyboard is remarkably better than the prior generation MacBook Pro that this one is replacing. The thicker case here gives you more key travel. The keys have a nice amount of firmness to them and a really good tactile feel. And I think this keyboard should last longer, and I'll let you know if it doesn't. The keys, of course, are backlit. They got rid of the touch bar, so you do have much larger function keys now, whereas before you had none. They even put a big escape key over there. The power switch is also a fingerprint reader, so this works similar to some of the other Macs that have integrated the Touch ID sensor. It unlocks very quickly, as you can see there. The trackpad feels pretty much the same as the prior generation, and that's not a bad thing. Apple really perfected this trackpad a number of years ago, and there really isn't a reason, in my opinion, to try to mess around with it because it is great. There are no moving parts to it, but they have a haptic motor that makes you feel like you're actually pushing something. It's a really neat effect. Now, the audio quality out of this is also remarkably better than the prior edition. The best way to describe the sound is rich. It's got a nice bass to it, but high-frequency sounds are also very crisp and clear. It is, of course, stereo. I think the fact that you've got this thicker case gives it more room for those speakers to breathe, so you do get much nicer audio here. Probably the best-sounding laptop I've reviewed in quite some time. And I would imagine the 16-inch might even sound a little better because it does have a larger case for those speakers. But they really did a nice job here improving just about everything across the board. And some of those improvements were fixing things that were broken in the past generation, but a lot of new things like the display and the audio are really nice surprises to see added to the mix. Battery life on this is excellent. This is an ARM-based processor, so it consumes far less power than comparably equipped Intel machines do at the moment. So you'll get easily a full day out of this thing. I have yet to really find the end of the battery doing the day-to-day tasks that I do on it. I've owned a MacBook Air M1 for the last year, and I've never seen a low battery warning on that thing, and this one is feeling pretty similar to that. If you start doing higher-end tasks like video editing and other stuff, that will certainly eat into the battery a bit more. However, doing those same tasks on this machine versus an Intel-based MacBook Pro will be night and day when it comes to battery life. I think you could probably get maybe 4 or 5 hours of decent video editing work time out of this one, whereas maybe you would get an hour or 2 on the Intel version because this consumes so much less power. All right, let's take a look now at performance. And I'm going to start off with web browsing here, which is not something this machine was really optimized for, but I think it's an important point to make. Last year, when I looked at the MacBook Air, everything I did on that surprised me from a performance standpoint. Web browsing was better. Video editing was completely surprising to me by how well it could handle even 4K video. It was just amazing across the board, especially given how little its power consumption was. Now, the jump from M1 to the M1 Pro or Max is going to be a bit more nuanced because you really have to be running applications that tax the CPU and GPU to see a huge performance gain. The single core performance out of this machine is identical to that of the MacBook Air in my testing. I'm going to show you 2 benchmarks now. The first is the browserbench.org speedometer test. On the 14-inch here, we got a score of 247. On the MacBook Air, we got a score of 224, pretty close. Take a look at Geekbench 5. On the MacBook Air, we got a single core score of 1,735. On the MacBook Pro 14, we got 1,776. So for basic tasks, these are not going to feel all that different to you. And if you're on an M1 now, when you make the jump to the Max or the Pro, you're not going to feel it right away. But there are areas where the difference is substantial. Let's take a look at some video editing now. So let's take a look at a 4K 60 video project that I've got running here. This is something I did on the YouTube channel a few weeks ago. This is running without proxy files. This is full quality here as we're jumping around the timeline. And I was very pleased by just how quick and responsive everything felt versus my MacBook Air or one of my Intel Macs that really struggles with doing video editing at this level of quality without a proxy or without turning down the viewport to a lower quality image. So that was noticeable right away. Additionally, when you start messing around with color grading and exposure, everything just happens quickly here, and you can immediately in real time just see everything running and make adjustments as you go. There's really no lag or delay here as I'm messing around with stuff. And perhaps on a Mac Pro or something, or a more recent Intel MacBook, you might have a similar experience. But for me, I was very impressed by how quickly everything felt on this as I was editing video with it. Now, one way we can quantify the performance gains is through a benchmark that I've been running for many years when I review Macs. It is called the Bruce X Final Cut Pro benchmark. And that test renders out a relatively short file here that has a ton of layers at a 5K resolution. And this chokes even this machine if you try to play it back in real time. Now, on that test, the MacBook Pro 14 here rendered that out in 11.5 seconds. Compare that to the MacBook Air from last year that did it in 18. And it doesn't seem like a big jump, but when you scale that out across a very large project, you can imagine how much time you'll pick up rendering with the MacBook Pro over a regular M1. Now, the M1 from last year was faster than any of the other Macs that I had owned and tested here on the channel before that. Take a look at the Mac Mini with an external GPU plugged into it. With that RX 580 installed, it was rendering out in 20.5 seconds, and this thing is consuming a fraction of the power that that external GPU and the Mac Mini was consuming with the Intel processor on board. So it's through these benchmarks that you can see where the power lies with this machine. The challenge is that there's not many ways that I can demonstrate it, and that is especially true when it comes to gaming, because Macs are notoriously not a gaming device. And this one really is no exception to that, because there are not many games that you can download that really take advantage of this processor. And even though it can run Windows, as you'll see in a few minutes, it's not all that great of an experience trying to get Windows games to run on this Mac. That said, there is a benchmark we can run to see how well it might do playing games if it had more available. And that benchmark is called the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme Test. We got a score of 18,487 and a frame rate of 110.7. And compare that to a gaming laptop right below this one on the chart, the HP Victus 16. You can see that decently spec'd out gaming laptop was easily bested by this single chip computer that consumes far less power. And you can see the potential that this has to be a real game changer for gamers. Unfortunately, there's not going to be a lot of games available for this one, if at all. There are games that run on it through Apple Arcade. There are some Steam games that are compatible with the Mac, but none are really optimized for this processor, and nothing out there right now takes advantage, from a gaming standpoint at least, of what this computer is capable of. The Pro apps will certainly perform quite well. You get a feel for what potential there is here, but a lot of that potential is going to be locked into certain applications that really tie into the strengths of this processor. Now, you can run Windows on these M1 Macs, and that functionality is improving day by day. Right now, Parallel seems to be the best way to get it working, and you have to do that through virtualization. You can't boot up into Windows like you could on the prior generation hardware. We're running Windows 11 here, and I've been able to run some basic apps without any real issues. You can also coax a couple of games into running. So this is Grand Theft Auto 5, and this is running at 1900 by 1200 at the lowest settings, and I'm getting anywhere from like 30 to 40 frames per second. It's kind of all over the place, and that's because this is an Intel game that has to be converted to ARM on the Windows side. There's a lot of emulation and translation going on here that results in very shaky performance. So if we were running this game natively with the power of this hardware, it would be a very different story. But here it's not been running all that great. But if you do have Windows apps to run, it's getting more and more capable of doing that. But again, you do have to install an ARM version of Windows through Parallels in virtualization, and that's where you're definitely going to want to have some extra RAM, but it's not as good as the Windows experience was on the Intel Macs. Now, as far as fan noise is concerned, you have to really work hard to get the fan to turn on this machine. Rarely do you ever hear it. When you do hear it, it is quite subdued. It is not very loud at all, easily the quietest fan I have ever tested on any computer, and it's only when it's really getting pushed, like when we were running GTA 5 there a few minutes ago. For the most part, this will remain completely silent. It gets a little warm, but not hot to the touch at all. And again, if that fan does have to kick on, you're rarely going to hear any noise out of this machine. So overall, I'm very pleased with my decision here, although I think in hindsight, I probably would have been fine with the M1 Pro in a 10-core configuration. The reason is that a lot of the work that I'm doing currently is not really taking advantage of what the M1 Max has to offer. The reason why I went with the Max over the Pro is that my hope is that at some point in the very near future, we'll see some live video production software like vMix be written for an M1 device. It's probably not going to come from vMix, but I know there are similar Mac apps out there on the Intel side that I'm sure will get the M1 treatment soon. And those types of apps really need powerful GPUs to get the job done effectively in the field. And the efficiency of these M1 chips is very attractive to me for that reason. So I have some aspirations that in the next 5 years, something will be written that will do live production that will allow me to make full use of what I have purchased here. But in the meantime, for the most part, for what's available software-wise, the M1 Pro for me probably would have been more than adequate. What was interesting was that when I exported that 4K 60 video that we were looking at earlier, this one exported that video only about 5 minutes faster than my MacBook Air with the M1. And the reason is they have the same video encoding hardware built into those chips. So it's really not that much faster on the export, at least insofar as video compression is concerned. But there will be areas where I'm doing maybe color correction or maybe some special effects or filters where that M1 chip will certainly render those things out a lot quicker. And as the machine is doing background rendering in Final Cut Pro, those are areas where I am seeing slight bumps in performance. But it wasn't as dramatic as the jump from an Intel device to an M1 device was a year ago. Again, more nuanced here on the M1 Max and Pro, but still a great piece of hardware and something that I am very happy with, and I'm sure we'll be seeing this thing on my table for many occasions in the next couple of years. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Hot Sauce and Video Games, Brian Parker, Chris Allegretta, Tom Albrecht, Thomas Anfang, Jim Tanis, and Handheld Obsession. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.